trouble talk is all you get, and you wanna hear it straight.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is the National Intel Report. I'm your host, John Stadtmiller. We're here with you on this Wednesday, 28 January 09. And as promised, I started Monday, and I'm going to do a series of this type of program until I'm done. I don't know if this is going to last another 2 days, another 2 weeks, 2 months, or 2 minutes. Well, I can guarantee it won't last 2 minutes. And the reason I'm doing this programming, folks, is simple. For every 100,000 we have whacking at the branch, we have one striking at the root. And this sickening thought occurred to me today, through the programming, and it's a need to know. For many people in this country, programming such as this, they have never even heard the likes of. That's why we want to encourage you to call this network. Get the business cards, get the bumper stickers, get the word out, folks. We're doing our job here. You do yours there. Inform as many people as you can. Now, I've never quite put it like that before, but we're doing our job. You do yours. On Monday, I did the piece by Benjamin H. Friedman, and he gave this at the Willard Hotel in 1961. I also wrote for McGinley's newspaper, Common Sense. Lassie Williamson, I did the story by him as well, Zionism and a Jewish National Socialism. And today, I'm going to get into Jack Bernstein. Now, you notice something. Strange, isn't it? That all of what I'm reading to you is coming from Jews themselves that have discovered what the problem is, and they've been warning people about it. Jack Bernstein, this was written, some 28 years ago, My Farewell to Israel, Thorn of the Middle East. And then we're going to do some programming on the Rothschilds and Rockefellers, what they've created, who they control, and bring you up to present day, folks. And I'm trying desperately not to leave any large gaping holes. But we have a problem here, folks. I'm not here to hype you about the police state. We know that it's coming. I'm not here to scream aloud, let's remember 9/11. All these are important issues. But the main underlying disease, the cancer that is rotting out this country, continues unabated. So if people feel good, and I know there's got to be introductory menus, if you will, to people coming in to the enlightened stage. But folks that have been with me for a number of years, nigh on 15 now, they understand exactly what I am saying and why I'm doing this. And I hope that you out there that have got into the channel-changing, knee-jerk reactionary...
Get ready for Real Talk Radio. You're listening to the National Intel Report with your host, John Stadtmiller.
What I'm about to share with you just doesn't come from any Jew. It comes from Jack Bernstein. And he was a Zionist, Ashkenazi Jew. And he entitles this simply The Life of an American Jew in a Racist Marxist Israel. My Farewell to Israel, Thorn of the Middle East. And before I embark on this, keep something in mind, ladies and gentlemen. The House of Rothschild are the fine people that financed and set up Israel. There's no coincidence that the Red Shield And that symbol that you equate with the symbol on the Israeli flag was the House of Rothschild symbology. And Albert Pike, back in the 1800s, penned a book, Morals and Dogma. And he also told people that there is going to be 3 world wars. Now, throughout this, you will have information given to you in a proper timeline that we can see, at least for the past 200 years, almost as long as this country has been a nation, that we have had and shared a similar problem, albeit cloaked, not spoken of, above a whisper, in the halls of Congress or in the Senate. It is what every congressman, every senator in Washington, D.C. is afraid of and will not speak out against it. Today, they're going to pass a budgetary amendment, another bailout. A private corporation, for whatever reason, for its failure, is being put on the backs of the American people. That is flat-out socialism. This is what the Grand Masters want for the entire planet. They control the money, hence control governments and corporations, and they don't give a tinker's damn who passes what law or utters one political speech or word in whatever country on this planet. It makes no difference. Jack Bernstein said, before Israel became a state in 1948, Jews worldwide were filled with the Zionist propaganda that Israel would be a homeland for all Jews, a refuge for persecuted Jews, a democratic country, and the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. I am an Ashkenazi Jew who spent the first 25 years of my life in the United States, the country that has given all Jews freedom and the opportunity to prosper. And prosper we Jews did, to the point that one portion of the Jews, the Zionists, have gained a position of political and economic dominance in the U.S. To fully understand the story I'm about to tell, it is important that you understand what Zionism really is. Zionist propaganda has led the American people to believe that Zionism and Judaism are one and the same, and that they are religious in nature. This is a blatant lie. Judaism is a religion, but Zionism is a political movement started mainly by East European Ashkenazi Jews. For centuries have been the main force behind communism and socialism. The ultimate goal of the Zionists in one world government under the control of the Zionists and the Zionist-oriented Jewish international bankers. Communism and socialism are merely tools to help them accomplish their goal. I was a victim of the Zionist propaganda. After 1967 war, we Jews were filled with pride that our homeland had become so powerful and successful. Then, too, we had been filled with the false propaganda that Jews in America were being persecuted. So between 1967 and 1970, approximately 50,000 American Jews fell for the Zionist propaganda and migrated to Israel. I was one of those suckers. After being filled with all the false Zionist propaganda, I felt that I would have a better chance to succeed in the new Jewish state. There was an added enticement, the spirit and challenge of pioneering and helping my fellow Jews. Jews. We'll get around to the diamond mines later. Dual citizenship. I had no emotional conflict with leaving the U.S. because I still was able to keep my U.S. citizenship and could return to the U.S. at any time. You see, Jews are allowed to become citizens of both Israel and some countries. The U.S. is one of those countries. The U.S. government allows a Jew to be a citizen of both U.S. and Israel. And as I asked the other day, then where do your loyalties lie? German Americans cannot be citizens of both U.S. and Germany. Italian Americans cannot be citizens of both U.S. and Italy. Egyptian Americans cannot be the citizens of both the U.S. and Egypt, but a Jewish American can be a citizen of both Israel and the U.S. This is a good example of the power the Zionist Jews have over the U.S. government. I arrive in the Jewish paradise. Before leaving for Israel, a Jewish friend of mine had made arrangements for me to stay a few days with her sister, Fawzia Dabul, and her spinster aunt. After arriving at the Lod airport just outside of Tel Aviv, I took a bus to the home of Miss Dabul and her aunt. When I saw Fawzi, it was love at first sight. I started calling her Ziva, her Hebrew name. Ziva is a Sephardic Jewess from Iraq who, like myself, had fallen for the Zionist propaganda and had migrated to Israel. She was employed as a hairdresser. After visiting with Ziva and her aunt for 2 days, I left to spend 6 months at Kibbutz Ein, and I do believe this is Hashelfet, one well over the 150 such communes that are operating in Israel. Since then, many more have been started, especially in the territory taken from the Palestinian Arabs. A kibbutz is a farming and sometimes industrial venture. It's important to explain that Israel's kibbutz system is a Marxist idea brought to Israel by an Ashkenazi Jew who migrated to Israel mainly from Poland and Russia. These Jews are part of that bunch of Jews we know as the Bolsheviks. Before 1917, they were the force that laid the foundation for the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 in Russia and the start of communism. Again, I want to point out, even emphasize, that it is some of that same bunch of Ashkenazi communist socialist Jews who migrated to Israel, gained control of the Zionist movement, and have dominated the government of Israel since its beginning in 1948. Now back to the kibbutz. Prior to 1967, most of the work on the kibbutz was done by Jews, but since the 1967 war, the work has been done by Arabs, who are paid a very low wage, and by volunteers from overseas. Members of the kibbutz, all Jews, share all things equally. They receive clothing, food, and a small allowance. All profits from the venture go into the kibbutz account for future use. Each of these kibbutz are affiliated with one of Israel's Marxist parties, ranging from socialist to hardcore communist. The kibbutz I was in was not hardcore communist, yet I was happy to leave after 4 months, 2 months earlier than originally planned. During the time I was working in the kibbutz, I carried on the courtship with Ziva. She was one of the reasons I left the kibbutz. After only 4 months, we were to be married. Our marriage created problems. The marriage ceremony was held in the Sephardic synagogue. The ceremony was simple but beautiful. Ziva and I were happy, but our marriage created serious problems. You see, Ziva is a Sephardic Jewess, and I'm an Ashkenazi Jew. For an Ashkenazi Jew to marry a Sephardic Jew is frowned upon in Israel by the ruling Ashkenazism. To understand why this is the case, you must realize the difference between Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews. The powerful Zionist propaganda machine has led the American people to believe that the Jew is a Jew, one race of people, and that they are God's chosen people. I will deal with the God's chosen people lie later. First, it is important for you to understand that Jews are not one race of people. There are two distinct groups of Jews in the world, and they come from two different areas of the world. The Sephardic Jews from the Middle East, and the North African and Ashkenazi Jews come from Eastern Europe. The Sephardic is the oldest group, and is they, if any, who are the Jews described in the Bible because they lived in the area described in the Bible. They are blood relatives to the Arabs. The only difference between them is the religion. The Ashkenazi Jews, who now comprise 90% of the Jews in the world, had a rather strange beginning. According to historians, many of the Ashkenazi Jews, came into existence about 1,200 years ago. It happened this way. At the eastern edge of Europe, there lived a tribe of people we know as the Khazars. About the year of 740 A.D., the Khazar king and his court decided that they should adopt the religion for their people. So representatives of three major religions, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, were invited to present their religious doctrines. The Khazars chose Judaism, but it wasn't for religious reasons. If the Khazars had chosen Islam, they would have angered the strong Christian population of the world. If they had chosen Christianity, they would have angered the strong Islamic world, so they played it safe. They chose Judaism. It wasn't for religious reasons the Khazars chose Judaism. It was for political reasons. Sometime during the 13th century, the Khazars were driven from their land and they migrated westward, with most of them settling in Poland and Russia. These Khazars are now known as Ashkenazi Jews because these Khazar Ashkenazi Jews merely chose Judaism. They are not really Jews, at least not blood Jews. Throughout their history, these Polish and Russian Ashkenazi Jews practiced communism and socialism and worked to have their ideas implemented into these countries. By the late 1800s, significant members of the communist socialist Jews were found in Germany, the Balkans, and eventually all over Europe. Because of their interference in the social and governmental affairs of Russia, they became the target of persecution by the czars. And we'll pick this up right after this break, ladies and gentlemen. This is history. I hope you're paying attention, because you, my fine friends out there, need to be the teachers of the unwashed and the uneducated. That's your... As I said prior to the break, in the 1800s, significant numbers of these communist and socialist Jews were found in Germany, the Balkans, and eventually all over Europe. Because of their interference in social and governmental affairs of Russia, they became the target of persecution by the czars. Because migration of these communist and socialist-oriented Jews began, some went to Palestine, some went to Central and South America, and a large number of them came to the U.S. Hence, political Zionism is born. In 1897, the first Zionist Congress was held in Basel, Switzerland. At this Congress, it was decided to work toward the establishment of a Jewish state, and a search for land on which to build this Jewish state began. Great Britain offered the Zionists land in Africa. The Zionists rejected. They wanted Palestine. At the time, Palestine was inhabited by 500,000 Palestinian Arabs and a few Palestinian Jews who are blood related and who had lived together in peace for centuries. With Palestine as their choice for a homeland, European Ashkenazi Jews began migrating to Palestine. As I explained earlier, most were communist and socialist-oriented, with some of them being radical Bolshevist communists whose aim is world domination. So when you think of Jews, especially as related to Israel, keep in mind that there is a great difference between Sephardic and Ashkenazi. They are not one united people. They are divided socially, politically, and especially racially. Now back to Ziva, a Sephardic Jewish, and I'm an Ashkenazi Jew, and our lives of the so-called democratic country of Israel. Now the Sephardic Jews, they're second-class citizens. For the first 3 years of our marriage, it was necessary for us to live in with Ziva's aunt. This was because of the critical housing shortage in Israel, and because of racism, housing is allotted as follows. Ashkenazi Jews who have lived in Israel for many years are given first choice. Second in line are the Ashkenazi Jews from Europe, especially if they're married, or marry an Israeli-born Ashkenazi. The next favorite are Ashkenazi Jews from the U.S., especially if they marry an Israeli-born Ashkenazi Jew. Sephardic Jews have the next choice of whatever housing is left. At the bottom of the list are Muslims, Druze, and Christians. Now, opportunities for employment follow the same pattern. Ashkenazi Jews get the choicest jobs, Sephardic Jews next, and then Muslim, Druze, and Christians fill the menial jobs, with a great many left unemployed. Even though I was an Ashkenazi Jew from the U.S., I was placed lower on the list for housing because I married a Sephardic Jewess. Being denied housing was the second experience of the intense racism that exists in Israel. From the very beginning of my arrival in Israel, many slurs were yelled at me. We American Jews were merely being tolerated, because Israel, to survive, must depend on the gifts of the American Jews and the sale of worthless Israeli bonds in America. There is jealousy among the elite Israeli Ashkenazi Jews toward American Jews, even if the American Jews are also Ashkenazi. Many times I was told, go home, we want your money, but not you. Spoken like a true Jew. However, there was a portion of the American Jews who were welcome and given favored treatment. They were the card-carrying communist Jews. Of the 50,000 American Jews, like myself, had migrated to Israel between 1967 and 1970, about 20%, or 10,000 of them, were Marxist-oriented, with a great number of them actual card-carrying communists. They were welcomed by the Israeli authorities and the local Ashkenazi, and were given favored treatment, housing, jobs, and social life. It must be noted, coming from the U.S., a great number of communist Jews were migrating to Israel from Chile, Argentina, and South Africa. Of the 50,000 who had migrated to Israel during that time, 80% of us eventually returned to the U.S. The 20% who remained were those who were card-carrying communists or sympathetic to Marxism. He speaks of the three faces of Israel. From what I have told you so far, you must have the idea that Israel is a Marxist, socialist, communist country. This would be correct. But Israel has three faces: communism, fascism, and democracy. The Ashkenazi Jews who migrated to Israel from Russia brought with them the ideology of socialism and communism and have put into practice much of that ideology. The Ashkenazi Jews who migrated to Israel from Germany, while sympathetic to communism and support it, tend to favor the practices of the Nazi-style fascism. During World War II in Germany, these elite Zionist Ashkenazi Jews worked closely with Hitler's Gestapo in persecuting the lower-class German Jews and delivering them to the concentration camps. Now, living in Israel, these elite Zionist Jews, who are well-trained in the Nazi-style fascism and favor it, have imposed many facets of fascism on Israel. To give the impression that Israel is a democracy, members of the Knesset, the Israeli Congress, are elected an odd type of election. This is where Israel's so-called democracy stops. It doesn't make any difference which party wins an election, the Likud or Labor. The elite Zionist Jews rule in a dictatorial manner, giving favors to the elite clique and brutally suppressing any dissent. In the Zionist communist scheme of world domination, it is Israel's role to continually stir up trouble in the Middle East, since wars are a big part of this scheme of aggression. It is only natural that from early childhood on, Israel youth are trained mentally and physically for war. For instance, Israel has its equivalent in Hitler's youth group. It is the Gadna. And all high school and junior high school students are required to participate, boys and girls. Like Hitler's youth group, the youth in Israel's Gadna are dressed in khaki uniforms, they take training, and engage in paramilitary exercises. Listen to the parallels that you're starting to hear coming out of the abomination, Barry Sartoro's New Deal. We'll be right back.
You're listening to the Republic Broadcasting Network, because you can handle the truth.
You're tuned in to the National Intel Report, the Real Talk Radio Show.
Even at play, guns and thoughts of war are present. When on a picnic, instead of taking along a basketball or soccer equipment, they take submachine guns and assault rifles and practice shooting and playing military games. Once graduated from high school, all young boys are required to serve 3 years in the Army, 2 years for girls, or 4 years in the Navy or the Air Force, 3 for women. Ultra-Orthodox religious Jews are exempt from military service. Once out of the service, a number of the ex-service people join the Shin Bet, the equivalent of Hitler's Gestapo. Like the Gestapo, they engage in repressing anyone who acts or speaks out against the Marxist, fascist government of the Zionist-dominated Israel. Like in Nazi Germany, all the people in Israel are required to carry identity booklets called Taudat Zahut in Hebrew. One day, I changed jackets and forgot to take out my ID booklet. When I went downtown in Tel Aviv, a police officer approached me and asked for my Taudat Zahut. I told him that I'd left it in my other jacket because I didn't have my ID booklet with me. I was taken to the police station. At the police station, the desk sergeant informed me that for not having my ID booklet with me, I could be jailed for up to 16 days without even being taken before a judge. All that was necessary is for the police lieutenant to sign a remand order. I asked permission to make a telephone call to my wife and tell her to bring my ID booklet to the station. The sergeant allowed me 2 hours to have any Taudat Zahut produced. I called my wife and she brought the document, arriving just minutes before the 2-hour deadline expired. If she had been late in arriving, I would have been jailed for 16 days for not having my ID booklet with me. This is just one indication that Israel is a police state and not a democracy. Concerning Nazism and fascism, please let me clear a point. Germans are an admirable people. I dare say even great. But in Germany, the general population were victims of the Nazis who through cunning and brutality gained power. In Germany, the average Jews were victims of the Zionist elite who worked hand in hand with the Nazis. Many of these same Zionist Jews who, in Germany, had worked with the Nazis, came to Israel and joined hands with the Zionist and communist Jews from Poland and Russia. If the two faces of communism and Nazi-style fascism that rule Israel, democracy is merely an illusion. Regarding the tie between the elite Ashkenazi Jew and the Nazis, take a look at the word Ashkenazi. Look again. Ashkenazi. Interesting, isn't it? There's great confusion regarding the relationship of fascism to communism. Fascism is National Socialism. Communism is international socialism. Israel's economy. Economically, Israel is bankrupt. Of course, this could have been predicted because Israel's economic structure is based on socialism. Whenever a government of a state and its citizens spend more money than the value of the goods produced, economic bankruptcy will result. If it were not for aid from America, Israel's economy would have collapsed long ago. Israel is a welfare state in every sense of the word. It is America's most favored welfare recipient. While American farmers, small businessmen, and laborers are struggling to survive, the U.S. government, dominated by Zionist Jews, are draining the pockets and purses of American taxpayers to support Israel's socialist economy and war machine. Remember, I am reading this from 1985. Since the Israeli government knows, and the favored Zionists know, that the Zionist pressure in America will ensure that America will keep sending them massive amounts of money, Israel's government and its favored citizens spend money like drunken sailors. This practice leads to inflation and eventually to an economic collapse. Comparing Israel to drunken sailors is unfair to sailors. Sailors spend their own money. Israel spends money it gets from America because Israel is a welfare state depending mainly on American aid for survival. It is on a downhill slide. In 1982, Israel's inflation rate was 130%. In 1983, it was 200%. And this year, being 1984, is expected to exceed 400%. That means a hamburger that cost $1 last January will have risen to $5 by the end of December. History shows that no nation mired in economic problems as Israel has become has ever avoided an economic collapse. Only with a massive increase in American financial aid can an economic collapse be averted. Even then, the solution would only be temporary. Regarding the destructive tendencies of socialism, there are circumstances that allow a country to successfully provide social programs to help its people. It is possible in a country that has sufficient financial resources and where its citizens are deeply religious and considerate of their fellow men. None of this exists in Israel. Even in countries where conditions are ideal, there lingers a danger. Since the government of the country provides for the needs of its citizens, most of these citizens have a tendency to lose incentive to work, and a country with a complacent citizenry is easily conquered. Tourism is one of the main sources of income. The largest group of visitors are American Jews, but there are also many American Christians who want to visit the holy shrines and to see the land of God's chosen people. These Christians come away very impressed and filled with religious fervor. While in Israel, Jews and Gentiles alike are carefully watched so they do not stray and happen to see a sordid side of Israel, the true Israel. Like in the Soviet Russia and other communist countries, visitors to Israel are taken on carefully planned guided tours. They are shown the religious sites, the universities, the lush orchards, the technical accomplishment, the arts, and to stir sympathy, they are taken to visit the Holocaust Museum. But kept from the eyes of the tourist are the ghettos, the prisons, where political prisoners, mostly Arabs and Sephardic Jews, are subjected to the most inhumane forms of torture. The tourists do not see the widespread crime activities and the corruption and the cooperation between organized crime bosses and government and police officials. The tourists do not learn of the true inner workings of Israel and the Marxist-fascist government, nor do they see Israel's racism. I met one American tourist who couldn't help telling me about the wonderful religious feeling he had being in Israel, the Holy Land. I remarked to her, just try giving a Bible to a local Jew, and you'll see how much religion and religious freedom there is in Israel. If seen by the police, you will be arrested. Regarding the Holocaust Museum, he says, I cannot help but comment, the Holocaust may not have happened if the Zionist leadership in Germany had not cooperated with the Nazis, if the Zionists worldwide had not persuaded various countries to refuse to accept Jews from Germany, the Zionists in America persuaded President Roosevelt to shut the door and not allow Jewish refugees, into America before the war and when there was still a chance for Jews to leave Germany. He has an asterisk here. It must be added that many people, including Jews, question whether the Holocaust happened as portrayed by the Zionist propagandist. At least not to the extent of the Zionist claim. And my figures have it, folks, at about 460+ thousand Jews in Germany. And there were most of the Jews in Germany. So how did this number inflate 10 times? It's a propaganda machine eliciting sympathy, but more important, you cannot speak against a Jew. That would be anti-Semitic. That would also be picking on somebody that has been so victimized, so very, very victimized. On the subject of religion, the land on which the present state of Israel has been built, formerly Palestine, was once walked upon by Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad. Since Palestine was the site of many religions and religious events and has many religious sites, it is rightfully referred to as the Holy Land. So one would think that Palestine, now Israel, would tend to have an air of holiness about it. When Palestinian Muslims and Palestinian Jews occupied Palestine, there was a religious aura. But since the Zionists took over the area and set up the State of Israel, it is one of the most sinful nations in the world where only 5% of the Jews are religious. It's interesting to note that who are strongly religious are Arab Muslims and Arab Christians, who make up a small minority in Israel. Israel law suppresses all religion. For instance, it is against the law to try to convert a Jew to another religion, even if the Jew is an atheist or a humanist. A Christian is permitted to preach the gospel in a church building, but for the clergy or anyone to even tell about the teachings in the Bible outside the church building will bring a 5-year prison sentence. For a Christian to give a Bible or religious article to a Jew will also bring a 5-year sentence. Even an act of kindness by a Christian toward a Jew, such as giving a gift of food, can be interpreted as trying to convert the Jew to Christianity and can bring a 5-year prison sentence. Wonder if the fat man down in San Antonio knows this. The one that is telling millions of Americans that Israel must stand at all cost. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope there is a hell, because I want that fat pig to fry up like a fatty old hamburger. And by the way, if they have any belief in what they're teaching, that is going to be their fate, because pastors and preachers and priests are judged by God by a higher standard than just the common layman. This is the same law of religious suppression applies to those of Islamic faith who in the act of kindness give a gift of any kind to a Jew. A 5-year prison sentence can result. The treatment of religious Jews is touchy for the ruling Zionists worldwide. Jews and non-Jews view Israel as a land where Jews may practice their religion without persecution. Therefore, the Zionists do not dare risk suppressing Judaism for fear of arousing world opinion against them. So the ruling Zionists merely tolerate the religious practices of the small minority of religious Jews in Israel. God's chosen people. The American people have been led to believe that the Jews are God's chosen people. This myth was started by a small group of Jews. A few Jewish leaders took excerpts from the Bible and interpreted them as chosen people. But isn't it odd that it is not the religious Jews who claim to be God's chosen people? It is the atheistic, non-believing Jews who claim that honor. Leading the cry, "We are God's chosen people," are the Zionist Marxists and the Ashkenazi Jew, who for political purposes chose Judaism and who don't have a drop of biblical Jewish blood in them. One Israeli religious Jew said it well. At one time, we Jews were chosen by God to be his messengers, but long ago, we forfeited that right. Anyone who's read the Bible with an open mind knows that God gave Jews of the time special favors, but it was in the form of covenants. In these covenants were conditions, and another word for covenant is contract. In these contracts were conditions. The conditions were that God demanded the Jews obey his word. Time after time, Jews broke the covenants. They rejected God and turned to adoring mammon. It doesn't take a biblical scholar to realize that long ago, even the real Jews lost the right of being God's chosen people. In comparing the degree to which the followers of three major religions practice their beliefs, I make this observation. Judaism for Jews, Sephardic or Ashkenazi, are religious. This is true in America, in Israel, and worldwide. Christianity, the Christians' religion, has felt the influence of Jewish meddling and infiltration, especially in America, resulting in confusion and bickering between the various Christian denominations. This has led to a lukewarm attitude among most Christians toward their religion. There is evidence to prove that Jews, or one of their many fronts, have started many of the Christian denominations and thus dominate doctrine. Islam. The Muslims who follow the teachings of Islam are by far the most fervent of the three major religions in following their religious beliefs. The Judeo-Christian ethic we hear so much about in America is a big joke, the result of an intense Zionist propaganda campaign. I'll toss in one last thought about the God's chosen people myth. God said, "Beware of those who call themselves Jews and are not, for they lie." Could it be the Ashkenazi Jews of the people to whom God was referring? Israel stirs perpetual war. In the Holy Land, it would seem that there would be peace. Instead, war and preparation for war is ever present. The Israeli military machine is recognized as the fourth most powerful in the world from the standpoint of the amount of planes, tanks, and other fighting equipment, plus the fact that it is of the latest design, does make the military machine of Israel very powerful, but in the army, serious weaknesses have developed. Now, this was 1985. He doesn't mention nuclear weapons because I do believe by 1985 it was being discussed, giving the technology to Israel as long as they just kept it quiet. Now it is believed, at minimum, Israel has 200 nuclear weapons and possibly as many as 400. That would make their Arab neighbors a little bit nervous because they could fry them like a French fry from thousands of miles away. My comment here, why is Ahmadinejad being put to the test? Because he wants to develop nuclear power in his country? But they could make a nuclear bomb out of it. And as I've said this before, so what? If I've got Israel and they absolutely want to blow me to smithereens, at least let me have the slingshot against the giant. Before exploring the weaknesses of Israel's army, let me briefly review each of the wars in which Israel has been involved. An average of one in every 8 years since it became a state in 1948. The 48 War. Just after Israel had declared itself a state, Palestinians and other Arabs attacked the Israeli army, which had been formed out of the terrorist groups, the Irgun and the Stern Gang. The reason for the attack by the Palestinians was to try to regain their homes, which, through murder and terrorism, the Zionists had confiscated. The Palestinians had been a peaceful people and were not trained in the art of warfare, while the Ashkenazi Zionist Jews, who had migrated from the Soviet Russia, Poland, and Germany, had more knowledge of tactical warfare. In addition, Zionists had built up a large amount of arms, which they had purchased from the U.S., and communist countries had illegally smuggled into the area. The Arabs were defeated, and in the process, Israel conquered more Palestinian territory. We'll continue with this right after this break. In 1956, Egypt owned the land through which the Suez Canal flows. Egypt's president, Nasser, declared his intention of taking over operation of the canal from England. This would have hurt England's colonial empire, so England, along with France and Israel, conspired to attack Egypt. With Egypt nearly subdued, American President Eisenhower stepped in and ordered England, France, and Israel to withdraw. At the time, the United States was still militarily strong enough to back Eisenhower's order, so England, France, and Israel did withdraw. This was the only time during the U.S.-Israeli relations the U.S. president put any interest of America ahead of Israel's interest. The 1967 war, tension was mounting between Egypt and Israel over territory located between the two countries, the Sinai and the Gaza Strip. To help Israel get an unfair advantage, the Soviet Union itself resorted to trickery. Soviet diplomats in Egypt told President Nasser to threaten war but not attack. Then Soviet diplomats told Israel's leader to threaten war and then go ahead and attack. This act of treachery enabled Israel to attack while Egypt was off guard and destroy Egypt's military capacity in just 6 days. It has been the goal of Israel's leaders to take over the land between the Nile and the Euphrates. Besides the Sinai and the Gaza Strip, which Israel intended to take from Egypt during the war, they desired the West Bank, which was part of Jordan, and the Golan Heights, which was part of Syria. So during the 1967 war, Israel resorted to trickery. Israel had technical equipment to intercept radio messages and change these messages, boil them, if you will, and then send them on to their destination. During the war, Israel intercepted messages from Egypt to Jordan and Syria and changed the messages, tricking Jordan and Syria into entering the war. The Arab countries were defeated, and Israel took a big step toward its goal of conquest by occupying the Golan Heights and the West Bank, as well as the Sinai and the Gaza Strip. Even though Israel's attack on Egypt is called the 1967 war, and often referred to as the Six-Day War, it can hardly be called a war. Egypt, the most powerful Arab nation at that time, didn't have a chance to fight. Trickery was on the part of the Soviet Union, and Israel, as I have explained, rendered the so-called 1967 war nothing more than a treacherous act of terrorism for which the Soviets and the Israelis are famous. Israel's attack on the USS Liberty. During the 1967 war, one of the most daring acts of treachery was committed. It was the attack on an American ship, the USS Liberty, by America's so-called friend, Israel. During Israel's treacherous attack on Egypt, the USS Liberty, an American surveillance ship, was cruising off the coast of Israel, monitoring the progress of the attack. Realizing that the USS Liberty was learning and recording Israel's acts of treachery, Israeli leaders decided to get rid of the evidence. Israeli planes and torpedo boats attacked the Liberty with obvious intent in sinking it. If the ship was sunk, thus destroying the evidence, Israel could go and blame Egypt for the attack, and the Zionist-controlled news media in America would have given the lie as fact with the intent of turning the American people against Egypt. But fortunately, bravery on the part of the Liberty crew kept the ship afloat. Israel failed in its act of treachery against America, its ally, but during the attack, Israel killed 34 crew members of the Liberty and wounded 171. Israel claimed the attack on the Liberty was a case of mistaken identity, but reports by the surviving crew and other evidence prove the attack by Israel was in fact intentional. Facts about the attack on the USS Liberty were conveniently omitted by the Zionist-controlled American news media. All that the Zionists told the American people was Israel had sunk an American ship, but that it was a case of mistaken identity. An investigation by the U.S. government was subdued and a matter quickly forgotten. This is a good example of the tremendous influence the Zionists have over the U.S. government. We will continue this into the second hour, folks. I hope you're enjoying hearing real. Ladies and gentlemen, hour 2 of the National Intel Report with some special programming. As I said at the top of last hour, this is going to last as long as it lasts. And if you're one of the people that needs your daily bad news fix, you may want to tune out of this program for the next couple of days. Because, ladies and gentlemen, this has been done before in parts and segments, but not as thoroughly as what I am attempting to do. And it must be made public record. The 1973 war, the treachery on the part of Israel and the Soviets had led to the 1967 war, embittered the Arab people, and immediately they began arming with the intent of retaliating for this Israeli treachery and try to take back the land that Israel had taken from them. By 1973, they were prepared. Even though several Arab countries were preparing militarily, they were trying to peacefully work out a solution with Israel. But Israel was assured that their Zionist brethren in America would use their power over the U.S. government to make sure that the U.S. would support Israel. So Israel's leaders continued to maintain a belligerent attitude. Realizing the hopelessness of further negotiation with Israel's leaders, Egypt, along with Jordan, Syria, and Iraq, attacked Israel. And they were winning. With Israel facing defeat, the powerful Zionists in America pulled the strings of their power over the U.S. government, and the U.S. government officials obeyed their Zionist masters. Massive amounts of U.S. military equipment and arms were airlifted at taxpayers' expense to Israel to bolster the retreating Israeli forces. This U.S. aid enabled Israel to turn the tide and emerge victorious. Yes, Israel was saved, but so much U.S. military equipment was airlifted to Israel at the time that the U.S. armed forces were left in short supply and in a weakened position. U.S. government officials are so much under the influence of the Zionists that they had alerted the 82nd Airborne Division stationed at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and U.S. troops stationed in Germany for the purpose of being sent to aid Israel if necessary. It's pretty sad that to please the Zionist power in America, the U.S. government officials are willing to sacrifice the lives of American boys to save Zionist Marxist Israel. Young men already in the U.S. armed forces and their parents, grandparents, brothers, sisters should especially be concerned about Israel precipitating wars and attempts to involve the U.S. in these wars because, if necessary, to save Israel in one of their acts of aggression, the U.S. government will bow to the American Zionists and send American boys into combat. The boys will have no choice but fight on the side of the Zionist and Marxist Israel. If American boys die in future Mideast wars, you will know that those responsible will be the Zionist Jews of America and the weak-spined politician in Washington, D.C., who bow to their Zionist lords. And again, let me remind you that this was written in 1985. I've said many times, ladies and gentlemen, there's World War III being set up in the Middle East. We've killed over 1 million Iraqis. I do believe they plan to go into Iran as well. This will be the start of World War III by the communist, socialist, Ashkenazi Jew that, by the way, controls the banking empire of the world. These people must be stopped. We need Americans to stand up for America. And that even includes you slimy little pieces of dog manure we call you politicians in the District of Criminals. Sorry to be so kind.
Get ready for Real Talk Radio. You're listening to the National Intel Report with your host, John Stadtmiller.
Now remember, as I continue with this, that the main objective for continued strife, war expenditures, death, mutilation, and worse, if there is worse, is one to pit one side against another. This has been their favorite trick. This is why we had World War I, World War I Part II, and we're soon to have World War III, actually, World War I Part III. So, bearing that in mind, I will continue. At this point, you may be confused. Israel and the Soviets are ideological allies. Both follow the ideas of Karl Marx, so both are communist and socialist. Yet the Soviets supplied military equipment to the Arabs, Israel's enemies, and at the time, the Soviets' enemy, the United States, was arming Israel. To understand the treachery which Zionist and Bolshevik Jews are capable, and to understand the treachery which took place before and during the 1973 war, I must explain the New York, Moscow, Tel Aviv triangle. To do so, it is necessary to go back a few years in history. A heavy migration of Jews from Russia to America started in 1831. Most of these were communist Jews, so many of these communist Bolshevik Jews settled in New York, and New York has been referred to as Moscow on the Hudson. It has been pointed out, and with good reason, that decisions regarding communist policies come not from Moscow, but from New York City. Whether this fact is a fact or not is immaterial. What is important is the fact that there is a close tie between the Zionist Bolshevik Jews in New York City and the Zionist Bolshevik Jews in Moscow, and extending to include the Zionist Bolshevik Jews who dominate Israel's government. The Zionist power over the U.S. government in Washington, D.C. stems from the Zionists and Bolsheviks centered in New York City. It is from New York that orders go out to a vast Zionist network all over the U.S., a network that influences the economic and political affairs not only of our federal government, but nearly all, if not all, state governments, and to a great extent, the governments of the larger and even medium-sized cities. This power of the Zionist Bolshevik Jews over the U.S. makes the New York leg of the New York, Moscow, Tel Aviv triangle a tremendous influence over communist policies. In viewing the 1973 war, most people, and it seems most Arabs, are of the impression that since Soviet Russia sold equipment to Egypt and other Arab countries, the Soviets were in support of the Arabs in the 1973 war. This is a false impression. To understand that this is the result of more deceit on the part of Israel and the Soviet Union, you must be aware of Golda Meir, the Stalin-Kagovich Pact. Golda Meir had been born in Russia, grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and in 1921 migrated to Israel. In 1949, Golda Meir became Israel's first ambassador to the Soviet Union. Representing Israel, Ambassador Golda Meir, a Bolshevik Jewish, met with two representatives of the Soviet Union, Kaganovich, and a Bolshevik Jew, and Stalin, who had married a Bolshevik Jewess. They made a secret agreement, a pact. Israel's part of the pact was Israel would not allow any Western country, especially the U.S., to build military bases on Israeli territory. Israel would allow an official communist party to function freely in Israel. Israel would not make any agreement to solve the Palestinian problem. Israel would influence world Jewry, especially in the U.S., to have Western powers adopt the policy of favoring Israel over the Arabs. Israel was to continue its Marxist economic policies and prevent any free enterprise tendencies. The Soviet Union's part of the pact was the Soviets would institute a pro-Arab policy solely as camouflage for its true intentions, which was to furnish aid to the Arabs, but never enough to enable the Arabs to destroy Israel. The Soviets would open the gates of Soviet satellite countries to Jewish immigration to Israel. Should this be insufficient, Soviet Russia would then open its own gates to immigration. The Soviets would absolutely guarantee the security of Israel. Both the Soviet Union and Israel would exchange intelligence reports. From the terms of this pact, you can see, and still is, the aim of the Soviet Union and Zionist Marxist Israel to prevent peace between Arab countries and Israel until all the Arab countries are forced to adopt socialism under the Soviet leadership. Now, this is kind of a misnomer, folks, because we're talking about the people that have the grand plan for the New World Order. Okay? These people, they do not recognize countries. They do not recognize boundaries. They do not recognize culture. They don't recognize anything except their ability to make money through the usurious system that they have created. And all of this is to pit one side against the other, to mop up, make money, while people are killing each other in ever greater numbers, and being justified by these political puppets that we see masquerading in front of our TV every single day. Why good men and women and children, ladies and gentlemen, are dying at the hands of these bastards. Enough is enough. And while I have a minute here, they're sewing up the sordid little deeds for these banker bastards in Washington, D.C. The second stimulus package, which I had already warned you was going to be over $1 trillion. What they weren't telling you, well, yeah, it's going to be 700, oh, it could be 850 billion, no, it could be even higher. What they're not admitting to you is the interest that the banks are going to collect on the bailout that we, the people, here in the new Soviet socialist America, is going to be paying these private corporate bastards for the pleasure of doing business with them. How do you feel, America? I would safely say a woman raped would feel more secure than you do now. Because at least you know who your attacker was. At least you knew the reasons why you were attacked. There's millions of people in this country that are going to find themselves out on the streets on their keisters that don't have a clue. Not one clue. Now you starting to understand, while I'm not out there with a bullhorn screaming, 9/11 was an inside job. This whole damn thing was an inside job. The police state, the emerging police state in this country, is an inside job. But in order to have honest government, you have got to remove the very thing that controls every move that they make. And I have very little patience with people that are just exciting people to make them nothing but reactionaries without giving them true history, without identifying the true enemies of this country and all of mankind. That one day, in hopes, with fair trade and honest governments, once again, that set up honest policies with each other, to deal with each other honestly and in the open. Until that time comes, folks, you're going to still leave the door open for these New World Odorites to continue to do what they are doing right now, and they are so very close. That's why months ago, ladies and gentlemen, I decided to stop the 9/11 crap. Because 9/11 is not an issue anymore. Any more than the assassination of JFK is an issue anymore. And that I'm not out there giving a little bit of information to somebody to get them all excited about something when you make them nothing but reactionary dummies. You give them no true history. You give them no real information that they can discern for themselves and make up their mind through their own judgments what has happened and what is going to happen in the future. Without that, ladies and gentlemen, people are doing a major disservice to you. They are only feeding their own egos and their own little agendas. They care not a damn about you. Understand this, and understand it well. I've seen a lot so far in my lifetime, folks. I have seen much. But it never ceases to amaze me what people will do if you throw them a lifeline of hope. They will they will just absolutely kill. They'll walk through busted glass on their lips if they think they have somebody that's going to offer them a little bit of hope. The only hope that we have, ladies and gentlemen, is the education of our fellow Americans facing down the true and honest, real problems that this country faces. I look at a cop with a gun and a badge. I know he has his marching orders. I know that this creature is not going to think for himself. I certainly know that he's not going to follow the Constitution because he was given a policy and a briefing at lineup in the morning, telling him what he was going to do and how he was going to do it. And it's up to us citizens out here that once abused by these Keystone corporate coffer cops, that we have to take them to court and sue them over their policies that are blatantly illegal, and unconstitutional. This is going to continue. They're going to try every which way they can. Because if you're a slave, ladies and gentlemen, with the ability for them to snoop and poop on your daily activities, and jail you and make laws, not the police, but our vaunted politicians, our legislature in Washington, D.C., that wouldn't know the Constitution from a roll of northern toilet paper, we are going to continue having these problems. So I make no apologies from speaking truth, folks, and I don't care who it upsets, and I mean anybody that it upsets, because I might be busting up their little agenda or their little hope for fame and fortune. I just want my damn country back. I want to get down to Hawaii, sit on a black beach sand, and drink drinks with little umbrellas in them, for God's sakes.
Ground beef.
In the conduct of the 1973 war, you can see part of this deceitful agreement being utilized, in particular the part about the Soviet Union helping the Arabs, but not helping enough to defeat Israel. In the planning of the 1967 war, Israel was aware that the Arab countries bordering Israel were buying equipment from the Soviets, an Israeli ally. But because of Golda Meir and the Stalin-Kaganovich pact, Israeli leaders knew the Soviets would not help the Arabs enough to defeat Israel, that the aid the Soviets were giving the Arabs was only bait to draw the Arab countries into the Soviet trap. Also, Israeli leaders knew that the American Zionist brethren were making sure the U.S. government was supplying enough arms to stop the Arabs and would send more equipment, even troops, if necessary. When the 1973 war started, Jordan, Egypt, Syria, and Iraq surprised Israel with their improved fighting capability. The Egyptian army faced what would seem an impossible task in an attempt to penetrate Israeli territory. First, there was a water barrier, the Suez Canal, to cross. Then, they would have to face a high wall of sand and the fine dust which was erected by Israel. Behind that wall was a third barrier, a line of Israeli fortifications. These fortifications were stronger than a Maginot Line erected by France before World War II to stop any German invasion of France. Yet by ingenuity, the Egyptian army crossed the Suez Canal, went over the sand and dust barrier, and broke through the heavily fortifications in a matter of a few hours. Israel was in trouble. The Arabs were winning the war. But as pre-planned, if necessary, the U.S. airlifted huge amounts of military equipment and supplies to Israel. As I mentioned before, the U.S. Airborne Division at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and U.S. troops stationed in Germany were placed on alert and would have been sent to help Israel and their forces if it became necessary to help Israel win the war. Fortunately for America, American troops weren't needed to help Israel survive. The additional arms were enough. However, the Arab forces were strong enough to stop Israel from taking even more Arab land. In fact, Egypt was able to take back part of the Sinai. Egypt's president, Sadat, realized that the Soviets had no intention of helping the Arabs win the war, that the Soviets, in selling them some equipment, were only trying to trap Egypt into the Soviet net. So Sadat kicked Soviet military advisors and civilian technicians out of Egypt. The 1982 invasion of Lebanon. In Israel, most Jews have become tired of Israel's involvement in war and aggression acts and want peace. It is only the communist factions that want the war. Sadly, it is these communists who are in power in Israel. The 1982 attack into Lebanon by Israel further divided the Jewish population of Israel, even within the more militant Zionist Jews there was a split. The reason given by the Israeli leaders for the attack into Lebanon was to root out the Palestine Liberation Army and stop their terrorist attacks into Israel. Many Israelis have dared speak out and condemn this reason as false. They have pointed out that in the effort to achieve peace with Israel, the PLO had, for 11 months, refrained from making any attacks on Israel. The real reasons for Israel's attack on Lebanon were, and still are, according to the latest headlines, it is the intention of Israel's Zionist Marxist leaders to carry on a perpetual war. The attack into Lebanon was merely another phase of Israel's war of aggression policy. Water is scarce in the Mideast, especially in Israel. Ever since Israel became a state, it has wanted the waters of the Litani River for use in Israel, and the only way they could get it was to go in and take it militarily. You know, just as a side note, what has always fascinated me was whatever happened to the desalinization plants. If there are wars fought over water, why not take the salt water and make it into fresh? We've got billions and trillions for war, but not a drop for dry land and the people it supports. Kind of fascinating, isn't it? Israel's leaders and the general population figured the war would last only a few days, but the Palestinians and other Arabs fought heroically against the Israeli invaders, who had far superior equipment. As the months passed without victory, and as more Israeli soldiers were brought home and buried, dissent in Israel itself had spread. In the Israeli military forces, many members resigned or refused to carry out orders because it would have meant killing innocent civilians. The death of the 250 Marines serving in Lebanon has been blamed on the Arabs. This, as it had been reported by the Zionist-controlled news media in America, but this has not been proven. In fact, reliable reports coming out of Lebanon indicate the terrorist attacks on the American Marine base was planned by Israeli military personnel or the Mossad, Israel's secret service. In that case, who actually carried out the attack is immaterial. Israeli personnel planned and instigated the attack. It is common practice for the Zionist Marxists to plan a covert act and then get someone else to do the dirty work. By instigating the attack on the Marine base, the Israeli war hawks had hoped the attack would turn the American people against the Arabs, and that America could be drawn into the war and further help Israel in its aggression against the Arabs. Fortunately, the American people didn't fall for the trap, save but one fact: 9/11/2001. Whether the damn buildings were blown up, whether airplanes flew into them, you keep missing the point as to why that had to take place. And it wasn't just to further institute martial law in this country. It was at the behest of the damn Zionists. People better start getting this straight. And for those that want to run away from these facts like scared little rabbits, get the hell out of the public purview. There are more and better qualified people to give you history, the way it really happened.
You're tuned in to the National Intel Report, the Real Talk Radio Show.
A good example of how Zionists will commit an act of terrorism with the thought of someone else being blamed is the Leon affair. In 1954, a group of Israelis set off a series of bombings of American institutions in Egypt, including the American Embassy. They expected that Egypt would be blamed for the bombings and cause a break of U.S.-Egyptian relations. Fortunately, Egyptian authorities caught the Israeli agents in the act of setting one of the bombs, and the whole Israeli plot was exposed. Most Americans are not aware of the treacherous Levon affair because the Zionist-controlled U.S. news media failed to report it, just as they failed to report the facts surrounding the Israeli shelling of the USS Liberty. When will Israel stir up another war? 1985, 1986? It's difficult to predict, but it is certain that Israel will cause another war unless the American people learn the truth about Zionist Marxist Israel and an act to stop the politicians in Washington from bowing to the American Zionists and stop using American taxpayer money to finance Israel's war machine. The weakness in Israel's military. There's no doubt that Israel has a powerful military force. The base of Israel's military power is the massive amounts of the latest equipment supplied by the U.S. and paid for by the American taxpayer. But serious weaknesses have developed in Israel's military. It is in the makeup of the personnel that the weakness emerges. This is due to two main reasons. Because Israel has continuously been involved in war or preparing for war, the cream of Israel's youth are leaving Israel, or they find some excuse not to serve in the armed forces. The Israeli army is so short of manpower that it's openly recruiting homosexuals, of which Israel has been an abundant supply. In 1976, an Israeli army officer testifying before the Knesset, and then again being Israel's Congress, said in effect, if we do not recruit homosexuals, we will not have enough manpower to fill the ranks. Also, it has been learned that Israel has had to resort to hiring foreign mercenaries. Another weak point is the growing ill-feeling between the Ashkenazi Jew and the Sephardic Jews in the Israeli army. This has developed because nearly all the officers are Ashkenazi Jews, and most of the lower ranks who must do the fighting are Sephardic Jews. Due to the shabby treatment of Sephardic Jews by the Ashkenazi Jews in the army, a mutiny by Sephardic Jews is a strong possibility. One could only hope. A warning to Mr. and Mrs. and Miss America. The Marxist Zionists who rule Israel and the Marxist Zionists in America have been trying to trick the U.S. into a Mideast war on the side of Israel. They almost succeeded when the U.S. Marines were sent to Lebanon in 1982. The blood of the 250 American Marines who died in Lebanon is dripping from the hands of the Israeli and the American Zionist. If more Americans are not made aware of the truth about Zionist Marxist Israel, you can be sure that sooner or later, these atheists who claim to be God's chosen people will trick the U.S. into a Mideast war against the Arabs, who in the past have always been America's best friends. Then, more American boys will die because of these clever, murderous Zionists who, incidentally, have been responsible for pushing America into World War I, World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War, the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, the Pakistani War. Are you starting to get it, folks? Do you see why this is so important for you to know the true facts? So you will not be deceived by people with their own little agendas, building their own little fiefdoms. For what reason? When they do not speak the truth, what good are they? While Zionist international bankers and other Zionist Jews were busy counting their profits from those wars, American mothers and fathers, brothers and sisters were mourning the loss of their sons and brothers. Will you someday be mourning the loss of your own son or brother because of Zionist treachery? Crime in Israel. Since Israel, formerly Palestine, is a land where Jesus and Muhammad once walked, it would seem the inhabitants of this land would have respect for this holy land and for the religious sites that exist. Nearly all Arab Muslims and Arab Christians do have respect, even reverence, toward the holiness of the land. But only a small minority of the Jews have the same respect. 95% of the Jewish population are atheists or secular humanists and are not held back by the Ten Commandments or other restraints on sinful human behavior. When the Zionist Bolshevik Jews won control of the Holy Land, every form of sin began seeping into this land. Within a few short decades, the Holy Land became a modern-day Sodom and Gomorrah. Drug trade, drug abuse, illegal weapons sales, prostitution, gambling, labor, racketeering, murder, extortion, blackmail, insurance fraud, loan sharking, and corruption of government officials and police. And let me not leave off this list one of Israel's biggest industry, that's right, the porn industry. Does that now tell you folks out there why the United States Supreme Court ruled that this is a First Amendment right? And you're decrying because your children are being molested by teachers now? One of the planks of the Communist Manifesto, ladies and gentlemen, is to corrupt the youth, to corrupt people in general, to destroy family units, to destroy what supports those families, their economy, and their country. Israel has a highly organized crime syndicate headquartered in the Bat Yam near Tel Aviv. Many members of the crime syndicate are ex-convicts and ex-commandos from the Israeli army, and they are highly skilled in the use of weapons and explosives. The crime syndicate in Israel operates openly because of corruption in the government and police circles. Some of the police and government officials are actively associated with the crime operation. The average American doesn't hear of this, the real side of Israel, because the Zionist-controlled press, radio, and television in America keeps silent about it. But in Israel, some newspapers report the facts. For instance, right in the middle of one of the pages of the Hebrew language newspapers, a couple of years ago was an article that said, in effect, what the Italian mafia couldn't accomplish in 40 years, the Israeli mafia accomplished in just 5 years. It has developed the largest illegal drug exporting ring in the Middle East, selling drugs mainly to Germany and the U.S. They've even set up a distribution network within Germany and the U.S. itself. Except for a few religious Jews who have emotional religious ties to the holy sites in Israel, and lower-class Jews who can't afford to leave, all other decent Jews have left and are planning to leave. One big reason is the sin permeating virtually every phase of Israel's society is too much for decent Jews to endure. Israel's arms industry. Since terrorism, violence, and war are the way of life in Israel, it is only natural that the manufacture of military equipment and arms has become Israel's main industry and export. During the first few years of its existence, Israel acquired its military needs from the U.S. and from communist countries. But gradually, with the U.S. assistance, Israel developed its own arms industry. Zionist domination of the U.S. government has led to an Israeli first policy. This Israel first policy has severely hurt the U.S. economy. Instead of manufacturing certain military materials in the U.S. and thus provide jobs for American workers, factories were set up in Israel with U.S. financing and technical assistance to manufacture these products. The U.S. has also helped Israel set up factories to produce electronic equipment, pharmaceuticals, chemicals, home appliances, all products that could have been produced in the U.S. While Israel profits from these Help Israel ventures, American workers are left standing in unemployment lines. Manufacturing of certain war materials has become so great that it has become Israel's main export. This war-creating country, which has been portrayed as the only barrier to communism in the Mideast, sells its war products to anyone who has the money, including repressive dictatorships, fascist or communist. Makes no difference. Israel not only sells weapons made in Israel, but also sells weapons supplied to Israel by the U.S. It's been discovered that some weapons used by Soviet forces in Afghanistan were made in America and originally shipped to Israel. Also, it's been learned that some weapons used by the Cuban forces in Angola were made in America and originally shipped to Israel. It is ironic that the United States, in a life-and-death struggle against the spread of communism, yet our Zionist-dominated U.S. government allows military equipment to be shipped to communist forces via Israel. A word about Israel's racist policies. You will recall that I mentioned my troubles in Israel began when I, an Ashkenazi Jew, married a Sephardic Jewess. Anti-Sephardic treatment by Ashkenazi Jews is even even an official, I should say, government policy. The racism runs deep in Israel and sharply divides the Jewish population. One day I entered a cafe in Tel Aviv. The place was crowded and I sat down on the only seat available. Also sitting at this table were 5 Sephardic Jews from Morocco. They learned that I was studying the Hebrew language, so they were helping me with my studies when a blue-eyed Nazi-type Israeli police officer walked into the cafe. He ordered me to get away from those kushim. Kushim in Hebrew means niggers. I replied, after I finish eating. The officer drew his service revolver and said, "You move now." "You had better listen to him," the cafe owner advised, so I got up. Standing close to me, the officer pointed his gun right at my face and ordered, "Throw your coffee and pastry on the floor." With a gun pointed at me, I didn't argue. I threw the coffee and pastry on the floor. Then he said, "Get out of here and don't come back." Later I learned that I was lucky. He could have arrested me if he had wished, and he could even have shot me under some vague Israeli law. In the U.S., if anybody complains of police brutality or misconduct, there's an investigation. But not in Israel. The person registering a complaint can expect police reprisals in the form of beating, besides being denied decent housing and decent employment because I was married to a Sephardic Jewess. I was the target of racial slurs. Sometimes I was even attacked by Ashkenazi Jews because I had married a Sephardic Jewess. Other American Ashkenazi who had gone to Israel and married Sephardic Jewesses received the same treatment as I, because Sephardic Jews are victims of the racist practices against them. I had often heard in Israel a Sephardic Jew tell a European Ashkenazi Jew, "Hitler didn't kill enough of you bastards." Please read the next paragraph carefully, and I will to you. I was born in the United States, attended public schools, worked in various parts of the U.S., and served 2 years in the U.S. Army. Not even once was I persecuted or had racist remarks made to me because I was a Jew. It is ironic that once in Israel, the so-called paradise for all Jews, I, a Jew, suffered because of racism. The Zionist-controlled news media in America has kept from the American people the news that Israel is intensely racist. Most Ashkenazi Jews in America are not even aware of the racism in Israel. Even those Jews who have visited Israel are not aware because they are carefully kept from witnessing racist incidents. However, Sephardic Jews in America have spread the truth about the practices of racism against the Sephardic Jews in Israel. Knowing of this, Sephardic Jews have not been among those Jews who migrated to Israel from America. From what I have written so far, you should now realize that few Jews practice Judaism. Most Jews are atheists, or they follow humanism, which is anti-God religion. So the portrayal that Jews are a religious people who took to Israel as fulfillment of biblical prophecy is a myth. Also, the portrayal that Jews are one race of people is a myth. The Sephardic Jew, Ashkenazi Jew, division is adequate proof. Racism, as practiced in Israel, is one reason that Israel will sooner or later destroy itself. Communism in Israel. The Zionist-controlled news media in the U.S. has led the American people to believe that Israel is the only barrier holding back communism in the Middle East. This would be humorous if it did not have such serious implications for the United States. From what I have said so far, you should now realize that Israel is basically a Marxist country, mixed with some Nazi-type fascism. A large book could be written about it, but I only wish to add. Israel is the only country in the Middle East that allows communist parties to operate. Well, we do here as well, excuse me. There are 3, ironically. It is the Arab countries which forbid communist parties to operate. The exception is North Yemen, which through treachery was taken over by the communists. Some of the Arab countries buy military equipment from communist countries because they can't get enough from the U.S. to offset the huge amounts of U.S. provides Israel. But that's as far as any Arab-Soviet ties go. The Soviet Union allows a number of Jews to leave if they promise to go to Israel, and Israel welcomes these communist-oriented Jews. It must be noted that once out of the Soviet Union, many, if not most, Soviet Jews come to the U.S. instead of going to Israel. It must also be noted that hundreds of thousands of Jews have left Israel since its founding. Some sources put the number at 1 million. Some of these Jews have requested to go back to the Soviet Union rather than live in Israel. Life for these Jews is better in the Soviet Russia. The latest scientific developments that the U.S. provides Israel is channeled onto the Soviet Union. The main center through which this scientific information passes is Israel's Weizmann Institute in the town of Rehovot, about 40 kilometers south of Tel Aviv. About 1/3 of the Knesset belong to the Israeli Communist, Socialist, or other Marxist-oriented parties. That should, he writes, put the rest to the lie about Israel being the only barrier against communism in the Middle East. In fact, it is the Arab countries that form a barrier that has stopped the spread of communism in the Mideast. Israel is one leg of the New York, Moscow, Tel Aviv triangle, which is behind the communist movement. At first Zionist Congress, which was held in 1897 in Basel, Switzerland, one of the goals was set to create a Jewish state in the land of Palestine. At that time, only a few Jews were living in Palestine, and they were nearly all of them, I should say, were Sephardic Jews who are blood related to the Arabs. These Palestinian Sephardic Jews and the Palestinian Arabs were living in peace as they had for centuries. After the Zionist Congress in 1897, European Ashkenazi Jews began migrating to Palestine and buying land wherever they could. Yet by 1920, Jews owned only 2% of Palestine. By 1948, when Israel declared itself a state, these invading Jews had increased their land ownership, but it was still less than 6%. To accommodate the increasing European Jewish migration, the Jews needed more lands, but the Palestinian Arabs refused to sell. So to get more land from the Palestinians, these communist-oriented European Ashkenazi Jews resorted to the one thing at which they were really adept: terrorism. Their first major act of terrorism against the Palestinians was at the Palestinian village of Deir Yassin during the night of April 9, 1948. Two Zionist terrorist gangs, the Ergun and the Stern gang, attacked and massacred over 250 men, women, and children. We'll continue after this break. I got a short segment here, folks, and I've canceled all other guests to this program because I want to make sure that everybody gets it, and I want to make it a matter of public record in my opposition to the
You're tuned in to the National Intel Report, the Real Talk Radio Show, only on the Republic Broadcasting Network.
I am going to stop right here and make a note that when this program uploads to the archives, we will have the site for the sources. And what I've been reading to you for the last 2 days, ladies and gentlemen, with the exception of the Tuesday program with Bob Chapman and Robbie Noel, has in fact been Jews themselves. Benjamin H. Friedman, of course, I covered that material Monday, and this by Jack Bernstein that was written in 1985. Now, I hope you noted that for the state of Israel, that I have reminded you people a long time ago, that the problem in the Middle East is not the Arabs. The problem in the Middle East is the Israelis themselves. While claiming that they're being attacked, have done everything under the sun to promote perpetual war in the Middle East and bring the United States in. We have witnessed that. 1.2 million Iraqis dead. For what? A Hitler-like guy that killed 1,800 of his own people? Well, hell. If human lives were dollars, would you take $1,800 or $1.2 million? This is to say nothing about Afghanistan, to say nothing about the impending plans for Iran. And look who they have in as Secretary of State. None other than this cast-iron bitch, Hillary Clinton. And I make no apologies for that. Trust me, folks, I make no apologies for that statement. A bitch is a female dog. That insults a female dog. I've got more colorful language for that woman, but not on the public airwaves. And a woman, we think as women as being caregivers and making nice little babies. Not this lesbian. She is going to further the aims of the Zionists, and we will have expanded wars in the Middle East. They are trying to bring about World War III, folks. That's why I said, for all you people out there that are still hoping against hope that Barry Sartoro is going to be somehow different. He's going to be George Bush on steroids. He will make overtures of peace in the Middle East, but he will continue with the wars, the unwarranted and unjustified wars. And don't forget, Hillary Clinton, Council on Foreign Relations, Trilateral Commission, and Bilderberg. She is in the hip pocket of the international bankster gangsters. The very people putting together the global government that you see now forming around you with the help of these. And these people are guilty of treason in Washington, D.C., folks. Make no mistake about this. That somehow that they're just dotty little aged politicians that don't really know and they're just there for their self-interest. Never make that mistake, ever. We've got some serious problems here in this country, folks, and they are not going to go away. They are not going to go away, and they're going to continue. The economic problems we have right now are going to deepen. And the very same Ashkenazi little bastards that did it in 1929 are doing it again today. But not one of these vaunted politicians in Washington, D.C. has the courage or the American patriotism to stand up and speak out against it. Save for one, Ron Paul, and he's somewhat muted himself lately. But I don't blame him. He's up there all alone in Washington, D.C. I canceled all other guests for the foreseeable future. I'm going to run through this information as best I can in its entirety. It must be.
With